Let's continue to get analysis about the importance of this particular two-day summit. Professor Isaac Khambule, Professor of Political Economy at the University of Johannesburg, joins us now. Prof, a very good afternoon to you. So we've been listening, of course, to President Cyril Ramaphosa touching on some key issues that I would imagine would be front and center during these particular talks, including mentioning, of course, geopolitical tensions. We've seen the trade wars also on a global stage. How important is this event as you give us just some of your highlights from that speech, do you think, for South Africa, but more importantly, for the Global South?
And to you and your viewers as well. I mean, this is definitely one of the most important events that South Africa has hosted, probably since the 2010 Soccer World Cup. And there are various reasons as to why that is the particular case. For example, the G20 is one of the most important platforms, and this also comes at a particular time where we know that the US has been in an isolation mode. And again, it also means that there's particular vacuum whereby leadership is needed, and it coincides with South Africa again being at the epicenter, hosting the G20 for the first time in African soil. So for South Africa, it presents an opportune moment to ensure that we can send out a message strongly that says these are the needs of developing nations, these are the needs of nations in the global south. And secondly, again, in terms of global nations, in particular within the global south, being able to take their space within the international development space, and also showing that they are able to lead global reform agendas that are pro the needs of developing nations. As President Ramaphosa did mention, that some of the core issues that the G20 is going to be focusing on are the needs of developing nations. And it is very important. I mean, if I can touch on one point, he mentioned that if you look at the issue of debt within the international ecosystem, we understand that majority of developing nations owe quite a lot, and they get charged at interest rate that are probably 8 times what your normal or what your developed nations are getting charged. And that on its own basically suggests that there's a need for particular reform that he was also stressing. And as I've mentioned, this definitely comes at an opportune moment whereby South Africa needs to play an important role, and as well as the G20 needing to play that particular role of being the leader of society, at the absence of what we are normally used to, of the US being the main leader and shaper of what the entire global ecosystem is going to look like.
And I want to touch on the US. We'll come back to that point because I think you raise an important point, because there have been questions around what does a G20 meeting under the US presidency look like in 2026. But before I do that, I mean, one of the important things, obviously, just in terms of reference to time and opportunity, is that of the AU and its Agenda 2063. They've now got a new leadership, just being elected recently. What should the focus be for the AU? And more importantly, will we see a concerted effort emanating from the new leadership, particularly that will see a renewed effort of solidarity and cooperation, given the backdrop of economic growth challenges that we've been hearing about, high levels of debt and the conflicts on the continent? And Prof, I just want to also remind you that we are monitoring those developments at NASREC, and we'll go there as soon as that photo opportunity with the president and some of the ministers does occur. But as you just your reflections on the role then of the AU.
The AU plays a significant role because we understand that only South Africa is a part of the G20. So again, with the AU being invited to play an important role, it also shows that now we are getting a particular platform whereby the AU would carry the hopes of all African nations. And with the new leadership, again, we also see them going to take particular stances that have been taken by the previous AU leadership that says it is time for Africa to take its place within the global financial system and as well as the global governance architecture. And it is time again that majority of the decisions that are taken also again takes into consideration the needs of developing nations. And in this particular case, these are things that are related to fairness in relation to trade. These are things that are also related to fairness in terms of how developing nations are treated within your IMF and as well as your World Bank. So some of these core things, again, also present a new path. And as we've seen in terms of the global challenges and as well as changes that are happening from the international system because of what the US has been doing over the past month or so, we also realize that, again, it presents an opportune moment for the African Union to shape the direction that the new G20 is going to look like based on the needs and as well as justice systems that we hope to see out of the new particular system that is going to promote the needs of developing nations and as well as also ensuring that fairness is supposed to be at the epicenter rather than the economic power of each and every nation.
Yeah, and just back on your points that you've raised about the US. I mean, many questions about what is at the center of the US contention. I mean, what is the long game here? Just read an article recently by Professor John Stremlau just on the position of the US in the G20 presidency in 2026. And I mean, also that Trump particularly is provocative interference in South Africa's affair is contrary to the G20 norms. So the question here is he boycotting South Africa or is he boycotting the G20 itself?
In this particular case, it seems to be the case that he's boycotting the G20 itself, in as much as some of the aspects are about South Africa and are about South Africa being seen as being anti-US national interests. But what we often see is we've seen that based on the trade war that President Trump has went on with the entire globe, he has also challenge the entire EU to say you need to change your stance. And if we look at the particular policy that he has taken in relation to the entire Ukraine and Russia war, it also shows you that he's anti some of the European decisions that have been taken, particularly within the G20. So in this particular case, I think what we need to be paying attention to is how South Africa seems to always be the particular scapegoat that is going to be utilized. I mean, for example, if you look at issues that are related to South Africa taking Israel into the International Court of Justice, that on its own has been something that has been cited by the entire US president. It's saying by South Africa taking that particular decision, it is something that is anti the interest of the US. And by virtue of that, the presidency currently in the US is basically saying every nation should agree to what we're saying, or if they do not agree, then it basically means that they are part of our enemies. And in this particular case, as I've mentioned, it seems to have created a particular vacuum within the global governance architecture, of which the G20 is supposed to take advantage of, because we know the G20 has always emphasized the idea of being inclusive, and the mere fact that we are hosting the G20 for the first time in African soil, again, accords with the idea of creating this just world order whereby the interests of developing nations are going to be taken into account. But we also see it again based on the transitions and as well as decisions that have been taken by the US president, including on issues such as DEI, of which the entire G20 has been pro-DEI over the past 10 to 20 years. And this again shows us that there's particular geopolitical tensions that are about to emerge between the US and as well as the G20. And these again gives about a particular platform whereby the G20, because it is more inclusive, needs then to play a particular role of ensuring that it influences the global development agenda rather than allowing the US to dictate what is supposed to be happening to the entire global development agenda.
Prof, thank you so much for your insights. Really do appreciate it. Professor Isaac Khambule, Professor of Political Economy at the University of Johannesburg, there for us as we continue then to monitor the G20 Foreign Affairs Ministers Meeting that's currently happening in Johannesburg.